Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, from wherever you are dialed in, and we'll get to find out in a minute. My name is Frank Sullivan. I'm going to be your host and guide on this particular afternoon. The reason why we've put Edinburgh Castle in there is because, shameless plug for our corporate sponsors, Cloudsoft. They are based in Edinburgh, and today is a very famous festival. It's Burns Night, according to Robert Burns, and we were just getting the lowdown on that. Today's topic is demonstrating the value of SRE. Right, this topic is going to be recorded. We're going to make this available on demand. But to start off, I want to introduce a really great panel. We wanted to put together a balanced set of perspectives and views. Dr. Alex Heneveld, the CTO and co-founder of Cloudsoft, Ashley Sawatsky, Senior SRIR, Senior Reliability and Incident Response Advocate. Have I got that right? I've been practicing that in the mirror for days. Andy McGuigan, the engineering lead, who's got a very practical frontline perspective, and Mandi Walls from PagerDuty, a DevOps advocate and self-confessed recovering Linux administrator. Do you guys want to come off mute and we'll do a quick round of introductions? Alex, you can go first. 15 seconds.
Hello, I'm Alex. I look after Cloudsoft's products and customers.
Ashley?
Hi, I'm Ashley. I am Rootly's incident response and reliability advocate. Before joining Rootly, I spent about close to 7 years building out Shopify's incident response strategy across the org.
Thank you. Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy. I'm based in Warwickshire in UK, although I originally come from Northern Ireland, hence my maybe slightly heavier accent. Worked for US companies most of my career, including Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Liberty Mutual, and a long history of doing SRE type work even before it was called SRE.
And if anyone needs transcription and subtitles, be sure to install the Northern package. Mandi?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Mandi Walls. I am currently at PagerDuty. I've been here about 3.5 years doing advocacy work around our products and SRE and DevOps in general. Before that, I spent 8.5 years at Chef Software doing similar work as well as other things. It was a startup, so you do all kinds of stuff. So yeah, happy to be here today.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is your panel for today. We're going to do a little bit of an introduction and then the exercise, and then we're going to do this in 3 parts. So first, to set the scene, right? We all know that the modern enterprise is getting a significantly larger surface area, many more systems, many more infrastructures, many different types of architectures, many applications, right? It's getting bigger and bigger. Software spend has increased by 20%. It's now, according to Gartner, going to go over $1 trillion on enterprise software. That's indicative of growth and a lot of things in the system. SRE has evolved as a practice since it came out in 2003 with Google. It's come into the mainstream. It's now crossing over into other disciplines, upstream into software, downstream into platform and infrastructure. And today's webinar is to ask, how are we demonstrating the value of SRE? Far too often we see a swarming effect as we go after incident response, or we see a lot of people kind of struggling to go beyond the technology and go on the technical challenges and get into this place of articulating, well, this is the value of what I actually do. Nobody has ever formally trained us to do that, right? We're engineers, we're software experts. We're not marketing people, we're not product design people, we're not people who have had to make a career out of constantly justifying value. We just want to get on and solve issues, right? Not necessarily our thesis. If you want to get the resources that will help you grow and build out these really important SRE capabilities, we need to talk about demonstrating the value. My background has come from building a data practice where there are a lot of experiences that are analogous to the SRE practice. We are not an invisible value protective function. We are a value additive function, and that's what the underlying belief behind this webinar has been all about. So I'd like to ask all of you, can you see the chat box? I'd love to know where everyone is dialed in from today. So if you want to open up the chat, there's a little button that says to everyone. Don't just send it to the host and panelists. I'll give us 30 seconds. I'd love to see where we are. So I'm dialing in from view from London. Don't mess with Texas, Switzerland, Manchester, Edinburgh. Wow. Wow, this is pretty global. Houston, New Jersey, very good. Nigeria, welcome, welcome Cornelia. That is quite a decent geographical range. Okay, so we're not going to keep our answers limited to a UK or US perspective. We're really going global here with this audience. Thank you very much for participating. This also has the added proof of concept to me that you are not falling asleep at the wheel, and I want to make this interactive. This is a protected space. Respect your fellow participants. Alistair, respect your fellow participants. This is meant to be a learning exercise. We're going to ask deep questions. It's okay to disagree. It's not okay to be disrespectful. So with those principles in mind, learning and co-creation knowledge being the objective here. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to put them in the chat box. Jordan P, I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of presenting to 50 people. I'm not going to answer your question, but you can answer it in the chat box. We have Ludo, our VP of Operations, on the chat box. Ludo, do you want to identify yourself in the chat box? He's going to be manning the chat as we go along, and we'll be curating things. So, kicking off, here's an interesting little thought leadership exercise to kick us off. If I can figure out how to get this going. You should all see a little pop-up in front of you, a little quiz. Can you see that, Ludo?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant. So, the little warm-up exercise today is how, from the SRE perspective, how's your business responding to you? Are you the Mercedes, reaching 1 million miles and just keep going from reliability and resilience and speed? Or you're this poor schmuck who's got to get out and push the ladder up the hill? How are we perceived? And then the second question here is, what brought you here today, right? This is not an exhaustive list, but we've got a couple of things that are really beginning to emerge as challenges. And they're not just technological, they're teams as well. Balancing feature velocity and reliability. Setting out the KPIs that matter. Cultural and organizational alignment. Does the business understand what we do? Or do we need to do a better job of educating them and demonstrating our value? Are we suffering with SRE burnout? Is the workload even manageable anymore with this massive increase in things coming into the IT estate? Or is it something else? You can pop it in the chat box. I'll leave this open for about 60 seconds, but thank you for participating in this. It's really useful for me to understand where are we coming from. It seems like we've got a pretty good balance. Interestingly, 67% of you have identified with the get out and push Soviet era ladder perception, and 33% of you identify with the 1 million mile Mercedes. Quick pulse from our panel. What kind of answers were you guys expecting?
No, I haven't looked at the full registration list. I feel like if I had company names, I might be able to guess, but yeah, it's an interesting split.
All right, so I'm going to share the results here. Can you see the results on your screen?
Yeah.
It's quite a big split. So we'll try and get into some of these key challenges during the Q&A, but let's get started with the panel discussion. So part one, 15 minutes, we're going to talk about the purpose and value of SRE. And Ashley, I'd love for you to go first. How do you see this topic shaping up? Are we able to demonstrate the value effectively? Do you want to get us started on that?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of level set, I'd say ultimately the purpose of SRE is to run reliable production systems and infrastructure. But the value, I think, is in the practices that make up the craft of SRE and how it's approached. So you'll see, I know Google, and I saw in the chat that Niall is here. So keep me honest if I get it wrong, Niall. But I believe Google likes to say SRE is what happens when you treat operations as a software problem. And I've always kind of liked that framing. And there's a lot of value in the focus of automation and removing toil, both to prevent outages, so things like, maybe automatic failure detection and automatic recovery, but also in how you respond to outages more effectively and reducing that time to resolution.
Alex, how would you pick up from there?
Well, I love that quote, but I think judging from the fact that 2/3 of y'all feel your organization's like the Lada, I think there's still a common perception that SRE is an indication of legacy processes. I think people often know that it's essential, but there's a feeling that, well, we shouldn't have to do it. Everything should just run perfect. And I mean, that would be a lovely pipe dream, but I think the Google approach is sensible. Failures will always happen. We always need to be continually improving. We'll always have second best. We're never going to reach perfection, but we should keep striving to get there. And I think that's how I like to think of SRE.
Mandi, how would you define the purpose of SRE today compared to the early Google days?
Yeah, I think for say that the average folks who are early SRE or maybe even SRE curious, I think they're looking for better practices for their entire software development lifecycle, where SRE functions are helping our application engineers be more productive and get more code out in front of customers, as well as preserving the reliability of the services once they're available to the customers and they're in production. So I think there's more of a consciousness, like you said earlier, about creating value via putting things through the entire life cycle in a more productive manner.
Andy, you're really on the sort of front lines of this with your team.
Yeah, let me kind of pull together Ashley's fantastic quote from Google about applying software engineering to system administration, and also I love Mandi being a recovering Linux system admin. We've all been there. What I can say in my experience as an engineering manager, hiring and building teams within SRE, both at Axon and elsewhere, maybe like 10 years ago when we were starting out, it was mostly people coming from more of a system admin ops kind of background, because that was what was in the marketplace. But certainly in recent years at Axon, we have definitely pivoted in our hiring to be hiring software engineers first and foremost. And then we kind of teach them about systems architecture, maybe teach them Terraform or whatever, but very much not hiring people who come from a bash shell kind of background, but people who come from writing software background. That's been a definite pivot in our hiring. So we actually literally are applying software engineers to SRE.
That's an interesting point. Also how this is developed is, the sort of, IT is not entirely delivered in-house. It is not, a reliability function is not swapping out physical hard disks anymore. There may be an aspect of vendor management or integrated workflows across the sort of ecosystem. Mandi, how would you characterize that as a challenge?
I think it's challenging for teams to have the sort of depth of knowledge that they kind of need across all these external platforms. It's one thing, like I said, I used to be a Linux system administrator, worked with mostly on-premises data centers, whole-owned data centers. So you could build every piece of the structure from the cabling up to your application, and you knew exactly where all those components were, who bought them, where the contracts were held, when they expired, all that crazy stuff that you don't necessarily need to know anymore. You now have someone else in the cloud who is taking care of all that stuff for you. However, because now more of our components are software defined, you need folks who still have that have the time to do a bit of deep dives into what's our best performance out of these components. What's the best way for us to utilize these external structures to get the use out of them that we need for our customers when we don't have full control over buying all of that substrate, right? We did not purchase the network. We did not purchase the storage, but we are going to consume these other components. And folks still need time to become super knowledgeable about that. And it's hard for some organizations to dedicate the people to do that.
Alex, I want you to pick up on this next, kind of from a sort of topological view. What's been your experience with this?
Well, what I see across our customers is just complexity skyrocketing, new platforms coming up, and the platforms do solve a lot of challenges. Kubernetes, tools like Terraform, the clouds, they take away a lot of our pain. But anyone who's spent more than a couple hours with them knows that they start to bring in some of the pain of their own. As you move up the stack or put new layers in the stack, you got to hope the ones low down the stack are working well, but the ones high up the stack bring in new challenges. And I think what's happening more now than ever before is the sheer number of these platforms, the services that we consume from AWS and Azure and third parties, and how we stitch those together. So we really, it's not possible to become an expert in all of them. So we need to compartmentalize our knowledge and have ways to share knowledge, share best practices, not just for deployment, but for operations. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing. And the software approach is the right way to address it.
I think the commoditization of these cloud resources and the speed with which things can be deployed by people who might not think about their downstream impacts really goes to Matt Simmons' point here in the chat box. He says it's easier to build but harder to debug. It seems like the breadth of what we need to know is increasing, but what's not decreasing is the depth of expertise needed to debug and repair all of these interconnected, increasingly complex systems. Ashley, I'm particularly interested in you closing out this part. You had a comms and a communications function that you built out at a really fast growth business at Shopify. This is not just about the remediation or response. How do we deal with things when they go wrong? And is that intrinsically linked to the value of SRE?
Yeah, I think this kind of builds on the point of how complex systems have become. I still can remember the first time I heard somebody say out loud this idea that like root cause is kind of a fallacy at this point. And we just, it was like a big mind shift when we just stopped trying to attribute a root cause to every incident and started looking at things as more of like a mix of different factors and failures and things that all came together in this perfect storm. But I think part of the challenge that I see for SREs a lot is that incident response as a whole has sort of expanded beyond just recovering the system. But like I've been in the SaaS world for about 10 years. It's not just fixing the system, it's telling the customers what's going on. And if you're at a certain scale, maybe it's even a higher level of external comms and keeping your executives up to date. And historically, a lot of that has fallen on the SRE where you're fixing the thing, but you're also explaining to everybody what is happening, what is broken, what does that even mean to the customer? Because that's not always obvious for your stakeholders who are maybe less technical when they see, something like US East 1, they don't know what that is. They don't know what that means. So SREs have had all this burden on them to sort of support all those other operational aspects of what's going on in an incident outside of fixing the actual problem. I think we saw something like the incident commander role start to emerge to answer that. But we're seeing more and more roles and different on-call sort of strategies emerge to hopefully alleviate that burden a little bit.
That's really clear. So we've kind of progressed through this narrative of where SRE came from and where it is today, some of the pressures, certainly within our own community. I know a lot of people here will be feeling that there's this increasing complexity and the more to do with not enough time to do it. And then, meeting those challenges, what Andy said, what Ashley has said about, reliably informing how we're responding. So 20 seconds each, to sort of summarize your key point on the purpose and value of SRE before we move on. Mandi.
Oh, I was hoping to go last. Yeah, so I think we've gotten to a point where we now have some vocabulary to share with the rest of the organization, like the goals and what we're striving for with production reliability, why it's valuable, why we need to work on it, why we want to dedicate resources to it, and how to put that back into actual roles and things we need people to do and the skills we need them to build. So I think we're improving in that aspect for sure.
Andy?
The purpose of SRE today, with the decade of knowledge we have built up, is to improve the internal developer experience so that software can be deployed faster and safer to end users, which is where the real value is to be found.
Thank you. Ashley?
I'm going to say to approach reliability at a systems level, fix things with technology as much as possible.
Thank you. Alex?
I think it's a label on the operations engineers who do whatever is needed to keep systems running well, from running around fixing those systems to feeding back into the business how to have made those systems better in the first place.
That's a wonderful conclusion. So to the participants who are joining us today, if you have any feedback or if you have any questions prompted from those takeaways from part one, pop them in the chat box, but time is a-marching and so are we. We're going to move into part two now and speed it up a little bit, vary the tempo. We're going to talk about measuring performance, right? What are the metrics that help indicate what's working and what's not? What are some of the useful frameworks for best practice that we can apply as takeaways immediately after this event? You might not remember everything that we say, but you'll remember Dora the Explorer. And then performance versus value. Do they really differ that much? Alex, I'd like you to get us started on this topic, please.
Happy to. I mean, there's a raft of metrics that speaks to an organization's health when it comes to creating, releasing, operating software. So if you're not familiar with some of these frameworks, check them out. Dora have done a great job, I think, of setting up DevOps. But I think SRE needs to look specifically at some of those metrics and some that aren't there. To me, it kind of really boils down to two metrics often and one question. And the top metrics I'd pick are MTTR and MTTF, mean time to recovery and mean time to failure, or incident frequency. Best way I've heard these described is we want to reduce the duration of the red periods and increase the duration of green periods. If we track those metrics, we get a pretty good view over time if we're improving. Now, it's not purely a reflection on SRE teams. It's hard to separate what we do from everybody else in the business, people producing the software, the partners that we're using to run those. But our job is to do whatever it takes to achieve those two things. And then I promised there was one question that boils down to what we measure, and that's really, how am I getting better? And I think continually reflect on that. How do we continually improve? What do we need to do next? What did we decide we need to do? Have we done it? Maturity models are useful for that. There's no golden answer there, but they're all quite interesting. It's going to vary on your organization, where you are and what you feel is needed. But having those discussions is essential.
Andy, on the front line with
Yeah.
your
So
team, what are you using for frameworks?
So there's a couple of things I want to pick up on what Alex said. Great starting point. What I can say that right now we're using an Axon. I can't obviously give precise details, but MTTD, mean time to detection, is a major initiative we're doing right now, and it comes really from the very highest level, like from our CTO. There are numerous reasons to do that, of course. Number one is make sure that we detect things internally with synthetic monitoring rather than customers detecting it. That's a major win for us as a business running SaaS. And also there's the learnings that it actually gives us. So if we have very effective detection mechanisms and observability, then we can use that to drive perhaps automatically creating incidents and driving that through and kind of learning. It's all about kind of gathering data in a much more automated way rather than, and I can speak personally, remember from even a couple of years ago, an incident starts or an issue is detected and you kind of like scrabble around and you kind of bring a team together and it's like, it's a little bit too manual. So certainly in terms of improving the maturity of how we handle incidents, and I know that's music to Ashley's ears. We are looking at the earliest point to detect, and from that, then MTTD, and then from that, automatically inject the incident response from that moment onwards.
Thanks, Andy. Ashley, over to you now to get the first perspective here on really getting into the meat of our thesis here, which is demonstrating the value, right? My thesis is that simply showing a scorecard or a self-service dashboard to your CEO that they're never going to use, that's not really indicative of the value that the SRE function, or whatever it's called, that's not indicative of the value that it's creating. So how are you demonstrating the value in the context of KPIs and frameworks and all these?
Yeah, I think just to emphasize what Andrew said about MTTD, I think that's a really great metric. Observability is so important and so overlooked sometimes in this whole landscape of incident response. So I definitely agree. I think a lot of folks struggle with MTTR because, like we've talked about, with incidents being so complex, so cross-functional at this point, there are a massive amount of variables and mean time to recovery. And that on a incident by incident basis doesn't always give you a lot of insight into your actual system health. But it is useful over time. But one metric that I would want to double click on is error budgets. This is something I actually recommend a lot. And I'm a big fan of this approach because I find that SRE teams sometimes struggle with this idea that, they're sort of the gatekeepers, the folks responsible for, keeping all those nines looking nice. But we sometimes have a tension between the SRE side of the house and the actual application developers who are being told, ship fast, move fast and break things, whatever, get the product out. And implementing error budgets, which if you're not familiar with an error budget, it's basically what is the acceptable amount of error that a service can accumulate. So when you look at things by service, it sort of instills this culture of reliability across your entire development org by setting a line of, this is how, we expect some failure, we expect things to break. And we're not aiming for 0 incidents because that's totally unrealistic, but you have to sort of draw a line of when does a system need to be maybe cooled down or need more attention. So having that sort of insight is really, really helpful. And then it means that your SREs aren't sort of beholden to things that are maybe outside of their control.
To borrow from Al Pacino in The Recruit, a bit of an analogy here that SRE is like the CIA in some context. Our failures are known, our successes are not. So Mandi, picking up from that, what if the success isn't visible? What if the value that we're, what if the value isn't surfaced to our constituent funders, our bosses, our business peers? What happens then?
Right? And the irony of this is it has absolutely no necessarily one-to-one correlation with SRE. This has always been the problem of people who run things in operations. As long as the things are up and running, no one knows you're there. you could be scrabbling, doing all kinds of things in the background, and no one knows if it doesn't actually have any adverse effects across the customer base. So this is definitely something that folks have struggled with for decades at this point. I think SRE as a I don't want to say as a movement, but as a practice, right? As a discipline, maybe, is a little better at putting language around the core concepts of reliability, what we're expecting, like we were talking about with the error budgets, like spreading that accountability out to the folks who can actually, implement the changes, put in the sort of non-feature operational requirements back into any code that is there, so you can close those feedback loops as things are dipping down, because you don't have to have like a massive catastrophic outage to begin to see from your SRE team that, hey, we've been integrating some things, we've been introducing some new features that are degrading our performance, and we need to get ahead of that. You can use those error budgets to figure that out without blasting things off the internet. But it gives you this place to have those conversations, to be able to say, hey, we know you have to do this feature work and this is what's coming, but here's what it's starting to look like. And being able to have those constant sort of health check internal conversations, so that the application engineers and even your business and product partners know, as you are making changes, as you are integrating new features, here's where it's impacting the customer and the reliability from an error budget and SLO standpoint.
It's deeply insightful. Andy, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I'm just going to add a little bit of a color around that. Great point, Mandi. In terms of observability, you need to know your baseline. What does normal look like? So building on that, anomaly detection. And again, that goes back to my point about MTTD. This looks a little bit strange. This is not normal metrics. So again, we're looking at that within Axon, and building a set of metrics with what normal or good looks like gives you that power to detect anomalies, and that further informs your ability to detect and recover from potential incidents.
So is there a bit of a nuanced difference here between reliability and resilience? Reliability seems to be about predictably staying online so that you can run a business, which is the core value of SRE, will keep you online. And then the resilience part of this is something will always go wrong. You can trust that we're here to fix it for you. That's the immediate justification of value. But how would you nuance that, or how would you articulate that from sort of dollars and cents perspective?
I'll maybe take this on then. So there's the ongoing fun topic of capacity planning and knowing how much you need to kind of grow. That has maybe become easier in the world of Kubernetes and kind of more automatic expansion than it was in the days of Mandi and I racking and stacking physical servers. But the resilience or the learning from patterns. I mean, you could be getting all things like DDoS attacks or unusual traffic. Building in those extra layers of observability and security certainly gives you a much stronger position on resilience and not just on performance.
We're a little bit past the halfway point here. Let me take a quick pulse with our audience. In the chat box, put a yes if we're hitting the right notes for you, or put a long, detailed, lengthy comment on how we can serve you better. I'll give you 30 seconds. Yes or no, are we hitting the right notes for you today? Folks, we're hitting the right notes. And by the time I finish this exercise, people still writing their notes will have lost their chance to complain. So, 20 seconds each to summarize. We've talked about KPIs and metrics. We're learning some new things. We're reinforcing some different ways of interpreting what's currently here. We've talked about DORA, SCORE, frameworks, the golden principles in the original SRE Bible. Now we're kind of coming on to performance articulated in the context of value creation, where value is keeping everything online and running, but performance is predictably doing so. So 20 seconds each. Alex, can you round us off on part 2?
Yeah, well, a big chunk of it of SRE is keeping the lights on, and you may have noticed that we had a spectacular failure here. There's a motion sensor, and I've sat too still, so the lights just switched off, which I guess suppose is probably a good thing. But when it comes to kind of why do we capture metrics, I think it is useful to know how much time do we spend just keeping the lights on, running around doing toil. But the reason that we're usually interested in metrics is to figure out how can we improve. I'll come back to that. And are we improving? We set some goals last month or last quarter. Did they actually help? Now there's a lot of noise in there, but metrics metrics help us internally. The other side of it, which I think started to be teased out, and I think we're going to come on to in part 3, is letting the business know that we are needed and we are doing a good job, or we're not, we need more resource or less. What are the metrics that we send out more broadly so that the business can figure out the appropriate way to keep operations running? And that's a much trickier set of metrics to find. That's
brilliant. And I've got this wry smile on my face now looking at Abel's definition, mean time to keep the money flowing. That's brilliant. Ashley, measuring performance and value. 20 seconds, please.
Okay. I think what we've seen is it is more complicated than simply uptime versus downtime. And having insight into your systems is a good way to prevent this sort of death by 1,000 cuts type of impact on your reliability. It's not always the big outage. Sometimes it's all sorts of little, frequently recurring systems with issues that are deeply embedded and maybe even outside of SRE scope. So yeah, that's what I'll say.
I'm going to acknowledge Daniel Marcus's question here, and I want your 20-second summary to respond to this question. How do you communicate to the business when it's not time to double down on reliability, when there are important things to consider, when there are more important things to consider? How do you inform your CTO and your business peers, quite a complicated business? How are you communicating?
Yeah, so I can really talk firsthand here. We have a very rigorous monthly business review. Most of Axon's leadership, I have to be honest, comes from Amazon, where I know this is a very much part of their business operations. So we have very robust metrics and reporting monthly to the C-level. And one of those we do report on monthly is the aggregate number of downtime minutes. Our SaaS operations actually run worldwide in many regions, UK, US, Canada, Australia, and many others. And we aggregate those all together. So that number is communicated in the monthly business review to C-levels every single month. So they are not unaware of it. And we've all felt the scrutiny of being asked to justify why these numbers have risen month on month. So that does lead to transparency of conversations. I think the short answer is making sure that the information is not hidden, and certainly leadership at Axon welcomes it, and that can lead to some uncomfortable meetings, of course, but at least you're making it clear that you're not, that we need to have the information, and that then directs leadership to make the calls. Do we want to take time? For example, the MTTD initiative came from a number of issues on that one.
That's my jazz hands. I'm not having a fit.
I'm done.
Andy, thank you very much. Keeping that transparent and predictable cycle of communication is really important, where it feels proactive. It doesn't feel like one of those bohica moments. Don't Google bohica. It's a term largely known to the American Navy. Mandi, tie us off here. 30 seconds, measuring performance. It's the top takeaway for the audience here.
Yeah, I think like the part that we don't want to overlook is like having those conversations like Andy was talking about with the rest of your organization about the things that are important, the things that are going to have most positive impacts on your customers, and also mitigate risks for your business. Like Daniel was mentioning in the chat about zero downtime deployments or disaster recovery plans, like melding that into your SRE practice as part of the plans that you're making and the things that you're doing it's risk mitigation, right? And it's also then throughput for the application engineers. All those things have value, and we need to be able to have the conversations with everyone else to talk through the priorities and how we want to implement those things.
I really like that interpretation. SRE isn't just the insurance policy, it's the thing that prevents it in the first place. Thank you very much. Let's move on to part 3 here. Business outcomes, right? There's often a disconnect or certainly a misalignment as backed up by the evidence from the survey, where we're saying there was cultural and misalignment of business objectives. You know, the outputs are not the same as the outcomes that we're aiming to achieve. When we talk about service level objectives and how they're set, but are they in the context of the business goals? Are they really tied back and tightly aligned? So part 3 is really talking about outcomes versus outputs. The costs to consider, is the cost relationship linear? Do we just throw more SREs at the problem, or something else? And then coming back to basics here, the conclusion, the 80-20 principle, what 20% of activity is driving 80% of the results and the outcomes that matter to the wider business. So I would very much like Mandi to start us off on business outcomes. You've got this wonderful breadth of experience. Let's hear it.
Yeah, so I think part of what I don't want to escape is, the accountability for reliability, resiliency, performance of the applications to the customer doesn't solely rely with SRE, right? So like we know our SRE teams are going to be doing things to improve our processes for the entire software development lifecycle. They're going to be helping us with your zero downtime deployments and building things so that you can actually get code out and improve your throughput and all that great kind of stuff in a safe way that preserves the reliability of our processes and our services for our customers and when they come to us through the production systems. And part of that too is focusing on sort of the things that we need to do, and a lot of organizations that are earlier, we'll say, in their journey would be looking for hopefully things like automation, things like improving the stack that they're working on. It may be a political discussion more even than a technical discussion along the lines of, we have too many of this kind of product. Can we keep this a little bit simpler so that when it does come time to use that thing as help for an outage or an incident, we know exactly how to find it. We're not looking at 5 different monitoring solutions because everybody's been allowed to have their own thing. And having those more judicial discussions across the organization to be able to say, this is the recommended practice that we want you to have, so that we can get to the point where everyone is in this better performing environment, where the places that we are deploying our production software to are aligned better for better observability, for better discoverability across services, for better incident response, if and when we get there, for those kinds of things. And I don't think it necessarily means that we have to hire a lot more SRE function folks that are sort of dedicated to that function. I think there's more opportunity for giving application engineers a little bit more responsibility towards the behavior and of their stuff in production, and hopefully they're on call for the incidents on their services already, and if they're not, that's a whole other discussion that you should have. And that we're working towards better automation and better components that are useful to those teams as well, so that we're not in the way, right? We don't want SRE to be gatekeepers. Like I've been the systems administrator of no, right? We don't want to be there anymore. We want to be facilitating software.
I see Andy in violent agreement there. Do you want to come in on that, Andy?
Yes, another member of the Department of No here. You're welcome. One of the major shifts that we did at Axon about 3 years ago was, so we had many many software engineering teams writing applications, and that was all fine. But there was still this perception that all on call went primarily to the SRE team for every problem. And that was sustainable in a very small way, but Axon has grown hugely over the last decade. So about 3 years ago, we actually shifted to very much more of a teams own their own on-call. You have to, again, leverage the observability. You have to set up enough monitoring so that your application pages you as the software team as opposed to pages SRE. Now, that may lead to an escalation. Maybe there's something which is not fixable by the application team. That's fine. They can escalate to SRE, but not using SRE as the primary responders. That was a major shift for us.
So looking at some of the downstream pressure that creates, I mean, how do you respond to that? Do you go back to them and say, stop writing crap code? Or do you
We wouldn't be here if we could do that, right? Like,
or do you gently encourage them and suggest to them that test-driven development might save
yes, it incentivizes higher quality delivery from the software teams rather than just throwing it over the fence. Right. Absolutely.
Alex, I'm keen to hear you step in on this.
Yeah, well, I think DevOps has shown us that this idea that there's some set of Swiss Army op engineers who need to fix everything are pretty much gone. As smart as we are, we cannot keep up with all the technologies. And I think actively involving the app teams and investing them in their applications running well is essential. That's what DevOps has shown. I think what's somewhat maybe been forgotten sometimes is the importance of traditional operations, traditional SRE. There is knowledge there that a lot of app developers don't typically have. They might know how to fix problems, but the whole emergence of incident management as a discipline, the set of metrics out there to see, are we doing well? There needs to be a function in organizations typically, which helps the app teams achieve those when they're responsible for operations, works with them, let them codify best practices really around operations, which is, I think, one of the biggest gaps. I also wanted to touch on Tonus's question if we've got great MTTR and MTBF, are we done? Sometimes yes, and I think there's absolutely maybe a point where, look, we've passed the point of diminishing returns. It's not worth having engineers working on X. But I don't think that those metrics are in any case sufficient to cover X. I did say there were the top 2 metrics, but there's a lot more. I think SRE is now, with DevOps, needing to address a wider set of efficiency and optimality of deployments. It's not just about uptime, but certainly security and patching traditional operations, but also how responsive, how quick is the application, and balancing that with cost, because the point's been made that if for every 9 we append to our reliability, I might be appending a 0 to a cost. And certainly there comes a point where it's not worth it. There are trade-offs. So balancing all of these things to figure out, are things running efficient? And at some point, the answer might be yes, and then you can step back and put your feet up or move on to the next thing. But technology will change, and at some point, the answer is probably going to be no again. And then you've got to come back in and look at that question again. How do we get better?
So I think just from a business perspective here, saying that MTTR, MTBF for Tonus is on the up and up, everything's stable, no snafus, everything's great. He can put his feet up, put the kettle on, and have a quiet Friday afternoon. But how much of that green scorecard and high performance is dependent on you, Tonus? What happens if you get hit by a bus, or somebody offers you a 30% salary bump, and all of that institutional knowledge walks out the front door with you? Is it not part of your job to make resilience systemic, not just from Alex made the point that a lot of knowledge sits within the SRE team that can be translated back to the application team. Food for thought, but it ain't my show. It's yours. Ashley.
May I add one more comment?
Please.
So briefly, thanks. We talked briefly earlier about the DORA metrics. Two of the DORA metrics are to do with pushing changes, software changes to production. So there's the deployment frequency and there's the change lead time. So yes, MTTR is one of the DORA metrics, how reliable, how stable your production is. But measuring yourself against state of the art in terms of change lead time. Does it take you a week to get a change? Does it take you a day? Does it take you 5 seconds? That might be an area to kind of improve in. If you're looking for, am I done?
So 20 seconds. Ashley, I want your perspective on this. Can you over-engineer SRE? Can you over-automate? Can you say we're going to blow the entire budget on engineering the human out of this to the point where that in itself becomes a concentration of risk?
I'm sure you can. I don't know that that's something I actually see in practice people attempting to do very often. Could just be my limited perspective, but I think overall, I totally agree with the points. I actually want to double click on something Mandi said about the fact that some things are more of almost like of a political nature in their solve. I think SREs are a really good canary in the coal mine for cultural problems and more systemic problems within your org. Something I encourage people to do to help surface that is to retrospective your incident more holistically. Like, don't just look at the technical problem and how it was resolved, but look at how people communicated with each other. What slowed you down? Where did you just like get lucky that if that didn't happen, it would have been a disaster? And I think the best SRE leaders are the ones who are able to take that and translate it into business impact so that your executives are bought into why this is important. And all of those things that you're learning can be used across the org and not just within the specific app that failed that specific time.
Not to detract from how incisive that point is, but if SREs really are the canary in the coal mine, then I have this vision of the CTO pushing an SRE down a coal mine and not coming back from that. That's a terrible situation to be in. So look, we're 5 minutes in here. Alex, 20 seconds, round us off on business outcomes and the activities that we need to look at.
Yeah, well, I'd say sounds like might be one or two of you who are in an organization like Maytag, where you've built the perfect washing machine and the Maytag repairman has nothing to do. But I think pretty much all of us actually are dealing with changing customer demands, new products, often larger organizations, lots of teams, and new platforms coming in that we want to use. So complexity normally keeps getting bigger. And in order to deliver the business outcomes that the MTTR and MTBF are going to just plummet if we do nothing, we need to get ahead of it. And I think for most organizations, they've we have a good job on our scripting side often in terms of how do we fix a specific problem. We're making progress on observability for specific domains, but we need to work on democratizing that observability, making complex systems operations accessible to people who aren't experts in those systems. So I can restart a Kubernetes pod without knowing a whole lot about Kubernetes. And that leads on to sort of where I see the trajectories going around structured automation, making sure that we can represent the topology of our systems and fix things at a high level without the need for that deep knowledge often. And I see organizations starting to invest in that. And of course, that's what we at Cloudsoft are working on. And finally, I think it's been mentioned, packaging those up into reusable best practices. We've got great reuse on the deployment side. We need to augment things like Terraform that capture best practices for deployment so that we have as code best practices for operations.
Thank you, Alex. It's going to take me the next 4 years of my career to unpack that. But we will write about that. Mandi, your conclusions here.
Yeah, I think we have an opportunity to have very sophisticated discussions with our partners in the business and in the product fields because we're going to be setting things like SLOs, right? And they should be driven by our business goals. And we'll be able to put some math behind what our business folks hopefully are talking to customers, what's most important, where do we need to focus our performance enhancements and that kind of work, where do we need to be driving things to better numbers. So hopefully can use the tools that we have and the numerical and metric goals that we have into having those discussions with our partners in the other side of the business. So if you aren't doing that yet, I encourage you to start forging those paths and having those conversations with those folks.
That's such a valuable activity to kind of bind technical and business audience together. I'll give you an example here of, you know, marketing, protecting the customer experience, liaising with the SRE team to do some research, saying what is the dollar lost value, how many transactions do we lose for every additional second of load time on the application.
Yes, you should know that.
Really
If you should know that about your
home.
services. Yeah.
Like we're losing $1 million an hour or $1 million a minute, for example, due to the following upstream issues that you got to go, we got to invest in, we got to fix, because your growth engine, your shareholder value, the profitability of the company is kind of linked to this choke point that doesn't really have anything to do with SREs being the solvers, but they are the canary in the coal mine, and they're the ones who can articulate the business case to the business person. You need to invest in the following use cases because they have a disproportionately good downstream effect, or you need to write better code because it's causing a poor customer experience, or things like that. And I think that's a wonderful way to bind the two audiences together. Great point, Mandi. Ashley, your conclusions here.
Didn't I already do mine? I have to have more.
Excuse me. Sorry. Sorry, Andy.
I think it's this. You know, business outcomes are all about, as you just mentioned, right, profit and loss and money. It all boils down to money. Let's be very candid about that. The history of engineers, software engineers in general, has not been very good at selling ourselves as a business function. And we need to kind of, I guess, maybe teach ourselves a little bit about economics. There's a fantastic slide deck from a couple of years ago, I'm not sure if anyone's seen it, called Things Your CEO Will Never Thank You For. Like, hey, great choice of hypervisor. You know, things your CEO will never say, right? We need to consider how we operate ourselves as a product or a service to the rest of the business, which actually does sell products and services to paying customers. And that may involve investing in, you know, roadmaps, internal kind of thinking about internal customers like software engineering teams, and empowering them to make their products and services deliver better outcomes. So we're like a second level of that, I think.